Let's talk about starting a force for the Plague Legion of Mortarion, with an overview of getting a Death Guard army off the ground in 40k 10th edition. Hello and welcome back to Auspex Tactics, where today I thought we'd do a start collecting video for Death Guard, going through a few ideas for starting the army in the 10th edition of the game. In the video we'll talk about why you might want to start a Death Guard army in the first place, some of their pros and cons with lore, price and gameplay, a few ideas for planning out an army and researching where you're going next, and then some ideas for miniatures to start with, models to expand with, and a few thoughts as to Death Guard in-game right now. Loads to talk about, so let's jump straight into it. In Warhammer 40k, the Death Guard are basically the Space Marine Legion that's devoted to Nurgle, their Primarch Mortarion making a great pact with the deity, while their ships were becalmed in the warp, accepting the blessings of the Plague God, which transformed his legion from regular Space Marines into near unkillable Plague Marines, festering skin, flesh rotting on their bodies, but incredibly hard to kill by normal means, such are the blessings of the God of Death and Decay. In battle, the Death Guard fight with grim attrition warfare, with heavy use of plague weapons and other virulent bioweapons, with bloated demon engines of Nurgle providing some heavy fire support and armour. The Death Guard also have extensive Terminator formations that are quite adept at boarding actions, and the Legion is organised into 7 great plague companies, each with their own agendas and preferred styles of fighting. The Death Guard are a horrific foe to fight against normal humans. The disease and pestilence that follows them might likely inflict far more casualties even than the great battles and attrition warfare, and Mortarion's Legion take pride in that there's little they cannot endure and combat to claim victory. Miniatures wise, they have a sort of medium-sized miniature range within Warhammer 40k. They were fairly recently overhauled in 8th edition, in which they were a focal launch faction alongside the newly released Primaris Space Marines, coming out in the Dark Imperium box set, and getting really quite a lot of love and attention and new kits at that point. Out of the deity-specific Chaos Legions that have been expanded, they've got far more options versus the Thousand Sons and World Eaters currently due to this. Multiple classes of Terminators, plenty of Demon Engines, and really quite a big roster of support characters. Plus they get access to a bunch of more generic Chaos Space Marine units, things like Land Raiders and Chaos Predators and Rhinos that most of the Legions have access to. Model-wise, they tend to be kind of busy and detailed, sort of decaying armour with heavy amounts of battle damage, and all sorts of wild and wonderful mutations as given to them by their deity. There can be quite a lot going on with them and different elements to realise on the models. For a few examples of the miniatures, here on the left we have the Plague Marines, the rank and file line infantry of the Death Guard. They get a higher toughness characteristic than most, and perhaps a surprisingly potent array of melee and special weapons for more standard Plague Marine troops. For some elites of the army, we have the Death Shroud Terminators, sinister bodyguards armed with great Man Reaper scythes. Enemy elites don't want to get in the way of them. For some Demon Engine support, we've got the Plague Burst Crawler here on the left, some side-mounted entropy cannons with a great big Plague Burst mortar to rain death and disease down on the foe. A smaller Demon Engine here on the right in the Mephitic Blight Hauler, packing a bunch of missiles and melter guns to threaten the enemy tanks and elites. The Death Guard have some raised cultist chaff, zombie-like poxwalkers, their deceased bodies reanimated by Nurgle, and then Mortarion himself. The Primarch of the Death Guard has got a rather spectacular centerpiece model. In general, he was really quite a popular kit, and has some fun details from his insect-like wings to his little attendants bearing all these senses of plagues, plus that massive bone-encrusted scythe silence. Finally, for a couple of examples of some of the more generic Chaos Space Marine things that you can add to the army, here's a Chaos Predator Annihilator for some long-range anti-tank fire support, and here's a Defiler. Both of these slightly older models compare with most of the Chaos Space Marine ones. They've been around quite a while at this point. Price-wise, I'd rate the Death Guard as somewhat medium for Warhammer 40k right now. They used to be kind of cheap by 40k standards when they came out in 8th edition, and they had a lot of discount deals going around, but that's far less the case now. Generally, Space Marines don't tend to be too bad in terms of the money for the models point of view, but Death Guard did have a fair few of their normally kind of elite models reduced in points quite a lot due to some underwhelming rules at the start of 10th, which didn't really help them. Plus they've got a couple of slightly annoying features in their model range, things like having their standard Plague Marines come in 7s, not in 10s, which limits how many of them you get. Plus a Combat Patrol box set that is generally considered not to be very good, unless you want a lot of Poxwalker zombies. They're still far from the worst faction in 40k for money for the points on the board, but they're certainly not the best either. Finally, let's get on to gameplay. The current rules are found in Index Death Guard on the Warhammer community page right now. Classically, the archetype of Death Guard tends to be a very durable focused, slow-moving army that grinds down the enemy by way of attrition, though arguably in 10th edition I'd say that's a bit less the case than it was in the past. Their units do get increased toughness values versus what you might expect elsewhere, say Terminators being toughness 6 versus toughness 5, but beyond that they don't really have a core durability kind of rule. They function as a bit of a debuff army, with their contagions of Nurgle worsening enemy toughness when they're near your units in an expanding aura as the game goes on, and they added in extra rules to layer contagions on top of that, usually meaning that within that aura the enemy is either -1 to hit, or you get extra AP when you attack them. Beyond that, they've got lots of access to lethal hits representing their plague weapons, generally meaning that most units will at least deal some good chip damage to units even if they don't kill them outright. You can have lots of units take small chunks out of enemies, either with lethal hits, auto wounds, or some mortal wound mechanics like the Biologist Putrefier, though some units certainly still can hit pretty hard, including things like the Death Shroud Terminators. Currently, in terms of overall power, they're fairly well balanced within Warhammer 40k externally at least. They get tournament win rates of around about 50%-ish, and at least the majority of the datasheets within their index are really quite usable, and you can't say that for all 40k armies out there. Overall, I'd say they're in a fairly good place. I feel like one often requested thing though is that people might like the Death Guard to focus on their more durable, sort of Nurgle resilient sort of routes, maybe getting some sort of core durability buff to add back to the army. Overall though, if you like the idea of a blighted legion of nurgle-blessed space marines, using horrific plague weapons to lie their foes low, then the Death Guard might be the army for you. If you do decide to go down the route of collecting a Death Guard army, there's certainly a fair bit of research that you can do first. Index Death Guard isn't the worst place to start to get an idea of their unit profiles and things. That's downloadable from the Warhammer 40k section of the Warhammer community website. Though if you wanted, you could pick up some past versions of the Codex that wouldn't have current rules, but could be interesting for a bit of reading and a general overview of the Legion. You might be able to find them going a bit cheaper second hand. Otherwise, for messing around with some army lists, you could put some armies together with things like Battlescribe, New Recruit, Warhapedia, or Games Workshop's app, and just get an idea as to how units could fit together and what your completed little plague company could look like. You can always do a bit of trying before you buy, maybe play a couple of games in Tabletop Simulator if that's something you do, or proxy some models in-game. And of course there's loads of stuff that you can find out on the internet. In terms of YouTube videos, I've made a few Death Guard ones. I did an overview of the index early in 10th edition, and then more recently talking through some of the strengths and weaknesses of each Death Guard unit currently. I'll link that down in the video description. Obviously there's loads more out here on YouTube, battle reports, painting guides, and all sorts of lore on the faction. Just having a bit of a search around and exploring them from different aspects can be nice, and there are a few channels that are quite focused on Death Guard as well. There's a good podcast called Disgustingly Resilient, and there's General Janice's Death Guard Tactics. Both of those well worth checking out if you want some focal Nurgle content. Otherwise, I'd certainly consider joining up with social media things focused on the Death Guard. All the major 40k factions have Discord servers, Facebook groups, and subreddits dedicated to them. They can just be useful just to imbibe a little bit as to what people are thinking about and discussing for the army, showing off some cool paint schemes and conversions and things, plus can be a place to ask a few basic questions to established collectors. Otherwise, at this point it's worth thinking about what sort of army you might like to wind up with. You can plan out a rough 1,000 point or 2,000 point army list, maybe using one of those apps as mentioned before. I'd say that for the majority of people collecting Death Guard, they tend to go for just a relatively balanced approach. They're an army that does have an okay range, but not an absolutely huge one, so most lists do tend to have some Plague Marines, some Terminators, plus some Demon Engines in support, plus a collection of HQs and characters. Generally having a balanced core to the army I think is usually a good idea going forward into the long term, given that 40k rules can certainly change over time. Though if you wanted to, you could maybe skew your collection in one way or another based on either lore or rules. I've seen a fair few people having success with Demon Engines and very armor focused lists, maybe a bunch of Predator Destructors backed up by Plague Burst Crawlers and either Blight Haulers or Bloat Drones. You could go for an army that really focuses around Plague Marines and Rhinos being the rank and file of the army, or a very Terminator heavy force, maybe representing the Ferryman Plague Company. You could go for maximal Poxwalkers and a whole bunch of cultist chaff, have the Plague Marines just be the centre of the army, and have a lot of disposable minions to get the jobs done. You can decide whether or not you want Mortarion himself, the Primarch at the centre of the force, or not. Really quite a cool focal model, but not literally everyone wants to be collecting the Primarch's own force. And you could expand the army in other ways, maybe going heavier or less heavy on allies. You can add Nurgle demons into the army or allied Chaos Knights. which could be another way to make a Death Guard army a little bit different. Otherwise, you could think about trying to come up with a force that's really trying to theme itself around one of the individual named plague companies, or a specific force from a confrontation in the lore. For example, the Wretched have their Twisted Psychers in good numbers, lots of malignant plague casters in there. We could go for Typhus's own first plague company in the Harbingers, where their own specific flavour of pestilence often tends to reanimate a whole load of poxwalker zombies around them, with the curse of the walking pox. In past editions, the plague companies had some of their own specific rules, but that's no longer the case in 10th edition. Any differences in army theme will be realised in the actual core codex when we get it, and will function as 40k detachments like the rest of the codexes that have come out. Finally, for planning things out, you can think about painting up a test model. I'd say a Plague Marine is probably one of the best places to start for the army. They're pretty representative of the faction, with the standard Death Guard green armour, plus plenty of mutations and other details to see how you're going to realise. A lot better to start with the rank and file and get a colour scheme that you're happy with, rather than going too heavy on a really big character or vehicle as your first attempt. As you can see from this guy, they do tend to be quite busy models anyway. It does mean that if you invest a fair bit of time and effort into them, they can be looking really quite cool. Fun little details and mutations all over the model, though they honestly aren't that hard to paint up with a fair bit of contrast paint. I think Death Guard are an army where it maybe is okay just not to paint every single little detail in 100% clarity. You could go heavy with some contrast paints and then pick out the things that are most noticeable about the model, trying to draw the eye just to a few key features as opposed to realise every single boil and pustule in the absolute highest detail. As ever with Warhammer 40k, there's plenty of great painting guides out there on YouTube. Games Workshop has quite a few of their own, but there's loads from other creators as well. There's plenty of ideas and variations as to how you can execute the Death Guard sort of army green kind of colour that they go for. They are certainly your models though, and if you wanted to paint them a different colour, you certainly could do. Maybe representing a splinter warband or a specific task force within a legion if you wanted to deviate from the prescribed heraldry. With all planning things out the way, let's talk about some exciting things with the miniatures. Death Guard I think maybe are a little bit unhelpful with places to start versus some armies these days. Generally the best advice is either to start with some core troops or the Combat Patrol box set, though Death Guard do have downsides to both of those sets. I still probably make one of those the first thing that you jump into the faction with though, and then think about expanding beyond that. Starting with the Death Guard Combat Patrol, it is unfortunately ranked as one of the least useful ones out of Warhammer 40k, as it's just really quite a specific and slightly weird combination of units for the overall Plague Marine army. This one really has a very Typhus and Harbingers sort of feel to it. In the box set you get the named character Typhus in his Terminator armour, 7 Plague Marines, a Biologist Putrefied character, the one with the blight grenades, and then not 10, not 20, but a massive 30 Poxwalker zombies. A kind of weirdly high number there that sort of dwarf the other models in the box. It feels like you get some Plague Marines with your Poxwalkers rather than the other way around. From Games Workshop at time of recording, the price is £95, €125 or 160 US dollars. That equates to a discount versus buying these sets individually of around about 36%. Not awful for Combat Patrol boxes, but maybe not standout either. And for the points for the models in the box, you get around about 405 points. That might go a bit up and down depending on balance updates. It is generally considered a bit of a weird selection though, pretty much Zombie Horde Death Guard if you want loads of Poxwalkers. So it's basically going to be a box set that if you want a big element of that in your army, it's going to be well worth it. If not, then there's a good chance that it won't. In terms of model use in game, I'd say that both the characters are kind of stand out good. The Plague Marines are very solid. The Poxwalkers I'd rate as usable, but maybe not all that common in optimised competitive lists, at least not in the numbers that they're present here, though having a few small cheap units for doing secondary objectives and grunt work isn't the worst really. I feel like when the Combat Patrol gets updated for the Death Guard in 10th edition, there's a good chance that it could get some more interesting units in there, perhaps some Terminators maybe. I think at present if I were getting into Death Guard, I would still pick up exactly one of these. I basically see it as getting a few useful units, plus more than covering the Horde element for an army if you ever wanted to field one. But maybe not necessarily as the first purchase for the army, it depends whether or not you want this first or as a bit of an expansion. Whenever I do these start collecting videos, I always like to talk about the different ways in which you can buy Warhammer 40k miniatures. If you're going with Games Workshop plastic, then direct from Games Workshop's Warhammer web store is generally the most reliable, but also the most expensive. Most standard Warhammer kits can be got from their official discount retailers around the world. usually giving somewhere between 10 and 20% off Games Workshop products, and for the most part there's no real reason not to use those if you've got them available. I've got a few of them linked down in the video description. Element Games in the UK for 15% off, Gap Games in Australia for 21% off, Fenris Workshop in Canada for 10% off, and Wargame Portal in the USA for 15% off. It can generally add up to saving a good amount of money versus the Games Workshop web store for most Warhammer purchases, and if you do use any of those via the links in the video description, a small amount of any sales goes to help support Auspex Tactics as a channel at no extra cost to yourself. There are plenty of other good ones around the world, of course. That's far from the only option though, as there's also the second-hand market. eBay can often be worth a look just to check for any individual unit you might want to add to your army. As ever, for pre-owned models, the quality can be a bit variable, but potentially can be one shortcut to save you a fair bit of money, time and effort in getting an army together. And particularly in this day and age, there's plenty of 3D printed options and third-party miniature alternatives. Lots of good alternatives out there. You can find a fair bit by just googling things like Death Guard proxy miniatures. I won't mention anyone specifically in this video just to make sure I don't get people into trouble, but there are certainly quite cool and creative models that are clearly meant to be Death Guard stand-ins out there for your STLs and maybe available via third parties like Etsy. Can be nice as an option to get some different parts and weapons for other customization and conversions as well. Otherwise, I think the other main kit worth focusing on in particular are the Plague Marines. They're the rank and file of the Death Guard. You get some in the combat patrol, but otherwise they're really not the worst place to start as a first dip into the army. The Plague Marines kit is a bit of a weird one by current 40k standards for standard troops. The box set only gets you 7 models in the squad, despite them being able to be fielded in 10s like the rest of the Chaos Space Marines out there. And compared with a lot of the rank and file with things like, say, Thousand Sons, Rubric Marines or Khorne Berserkers, there's a pretty vast array of different weapon options that you can equip your Plague Marines with. And they have been treated a bit weirdly in 40k 10th edition, as it currently means that it's just a bit of a waste to field your basic Death Guard Plague Marines with bolters, perhaps the armaments that you'd usually picture them with in the lore. Don't know if Games Workshop might try and do something a bit creative, like make a split datasheet for them to represent a bit more of a rank and file one versus a specialist one. That could be kind of fun in their codex, but barring anything like that, it generally makes sense to load up with a lot of special and cool weapons, which are pretty fun to be fair. I think the highest value things are the heavy plague weapons, so things like the flail and the champion fist, and then maxing out on special weapons, which I think are at least fairly well balanced. At least some arguments for taking some blight launchers, plasma guns and melter guns in there, and plague spears can be taken in addition to that, so they're pretty nice as well. In competitive lists they often tend to be fielded in rhinos and more often in 5s and 10s. I probably aim to build up the core of the Plague Marine army via this kit. There are some additional sculpts for Plague Marines and champions and things out there in character miniatures, a champion that's sold separately and one that comes in a kit alongside some other characters. Otherwise, beyond the core troops and combat patrol type things, I'd say it's well worth adding in some demon engines. Plague burst crawlers are really quite nice and have historically tended to be quite strong as firepower units for the army, maybe with entropy cannons for some anti-tank and some nice indirect fire from the mortar. Bloat drones are quite cheap at time of recording, quite nice to have as outriders. I'll probably aim to arm them either with the flesh mowers or the plague sprayer type loadout for some good overwatch. Death Shroud Terminators with their Man Reapers do a good job of being the army's fighting elite. They hit on 2s and are just very general purpose, with a whole bunch of damage 2 attacks that can make some good use of the Contagion's debuffs in melee. They're really quite slow on the board, but you might want to have them delivered via rapid ingress. And as mentioned, some Rhinos for Plague Marines can be quite nice. Again, it's good to get them into central objectives, particularly with a couple of interesting characters attached, maybe like that Biologist Putrefier or Foul Blightspawn. Speaking of him, he gets a Plague Sprayer and gives the option for the unit to fight first, which is rather nice. And if you wanted some allied units in the army, you could think about some Nurglings maybe. One weakness of the Death Guard is they don't have many cheap units and don't have any units that can infiltrate. These guys can do both as well as Deep Strike, and you can find their rules in the Chaos Demons digital index. They're pretty good for secondary support, though bear in mind allies like this really tends to wax and wane. While they're kind of amazing for the Death Guard at the moment, I wouldn't hold out that as a likely option for the extreme long term. There's multiple sort of small rules tweaks that Games Workshop could make that mean that they might not be that good an idea. Another interesting option is seeing what sort of things are the best points per money out of the Death Guard army. And 2 of the better options from Games Workshop at the moment are Lord Felthius and his Tainted Cohort, or the Mephitic Blight Hauler. The Tainted Cohort is a kind of curious kit really. You get a slightly cartoony looking Lord of Contagion, and then 3 Blight Lord Terminators that you could normally only field in 5s. Potentially could be interesting to get some Terminator bodies and do a bit of conversion work with them, maybe with some spares from Plague Marines or something else. If you can try and make them neatly fit into some versions of units like either the Blight Lord or maybe even convert some scythes to make them Death Shroud, that could be interesting enough. Plus you've got the Lord of Contagion character as well. I'll admit not everyone is a fan of his model. Otherwise, Mephitic Blight Haulers are a bit cheaper than most demon engines of their similar sort of points cost. Fairly small models, but still get you a fair amount of points in game. They're $29 from Games Workshop right now, and can be a way to add a fair bit of points to the army without breaking the bank. Otherwise, for kits beyond the core range dimension, I think it's probably worth highlighting the Galapox Infected Kill Team as an option. This is the kit that I'd use if you wanted to get some Death Guard spawn, as it's got some really quite awesome Nurgle models to represent them. The kit's mainly aimed for Kill Team, and these guys represent the warped crew of a spaceship, plus some Nurglish hangers-on. You also get some medium-sized mutants that could fill out the ranks of Poxwalkers a bit more perhaps, plus loads of little guys with a bunch of flies and small mites and things that you could add as little interesting base fascinators, or maybe add a bit more Nurgle flavour to certain bigger vehicles out there, say if you were trying to build a Death Guard Land Raider or Predator. Finally, beyond combat patrols and things, it's worth mentioning that there's some past discount sets that you might find out there, either at local gaming stores or maybe online. The last Christmas box set that the Death Guard got was this Council of the Death Lord one, containing Mortarion, some Terminators and Plague Marines here. This was generally seen as at least a fairly popular one, and wouldn't be the worst way to get a hold of the Primarch and expand the army. I thought the Boarding Patrol was alright as well. That one gets you a Lord of Virulence, some Death Shroud Terminators, and more Plague Marines. If you do happen to stumble across either of those at some sort of semblance of their original price, could be alright, though bear in mind that they're only value box sets, and if they aren't giving you a good discount on the kits bought separately, then it's not really worth considering them, and you'd be better off just picking up the models that you actually want from a discount retailer. Between all that, I'd think about starting with a core force of Plague Marines, maybe the Combat Patrol if you fancy it, and then expanding with a few of the units that I've already mentioned. As ever in Warhammer 40k, there's a lot of scope for just collecting what you like the look of most, as 40k rules change over time with balance updates and things, but cool models that you like the look of and the feel of and paint well, they'll last beyond from rules update to rules update and addition to addition. At least at the moment, I'd argue that the vast majority of Codex Death Guard is at least fairly usable in game, and I'd aim to build up a balanced core of the army and then add elements that further interest you. Maybe if you're thinking about what a balanced Death Guard army to aim for a force of around about 2,000 to 3,000 points or so, I'd probably aim to build up a combat patrol to get a few characters plus more than cover the horde element of the army if and when you want one. I'd probably aim for somewhere around 20 to 30 Plague Marines with perhaps a Rhino or two to transport some of them into battle. Maybe a little bit of flexibility on the war gear, so you've got the option of different special weapons or different melee loadouts as suits your purpose. I'd aim to have a couple of copies of each demon engine, maybe magnetising out certain weapon options so you could field things like the Plague Burst Crawlers, either with their Plague Flamers or with the Entropy Cannons, and a good contingent both of Blight Lord and Death Shroud Terminators. Currently the Blight Lords rarely are seen in competitive lists, but it usually winds up being that at least one of those tends to be a pretty good unit for the Death Guard to have as your Vanguard elite. For support characters, I probably wouldn't go too heavy and just pick up the ones that interest you the most. Typhus and the Biologist Putrefier are really quite good at the moment, though likely some of them will have their fortunes wax and wane, and of course Mortarion himself is there if you want a centerpiece model. In general, I'd kind of keep the focus on their unique stuff more so than the more generic Chaos things that you can have as add-ons, things like Hellbrutes, Chaos Predators and Land Raiders and the like. I feel like in the history of these Divergent Legions, you often tend to get a lot more focus and balance efforts go towards their unique stuff versus their generic Chaos Space Marine tools, even if a lot of the time a few of them do stay quite usable. If you're collecting Death Guard, I'd keep the focus on the core Death Guard units and then just see the other things as maybe a little bit auxiliary, whether it's non-Death Guard themed vehicles and support stuff or more allies out there which just aren't as guarantees to stay with the faction in a useful way in the long term. Overall, I'd have a rough sort of idea of a 2,000 point army list and work towards it, playing games and adapting as you go, learning what you like and what you don't and your playstyle for the faction, and maybe not rushing out and buying just the latest tournament list or whatever, given that things like that are going to change over time. Finally, let's talk some rules and what's going to be happening for Death Guard in 10th edition. Currently at the moment, Index Death Guard It's freely downloadable on Warhammer Community's download section under Warhammer 40K. You could also reference rules with things like Warhammer's app or Warhapedia as well. And the latest points cost for the army can be found in the same place in the Minotaur and Field Manual. If you wanted in-game references, then you could find some index cards to pick up, quick reference flashcards for the units in the army, though they'll only be up to date until the Codex comes out sometime later in the edition. For the 10th edition Codex for Death Guard, currently we don't know exactly when it's going to be. Given Games Workshop's Codex schedule, it sounds like it won't be out until at least autumn 2024, and it could be significantly after this. At time of recording, it's not officially announced by Games Workshop. As ever, the codexes for the army will change things quite a lot. The main edition will be different attachments to the way that you play. The actual data sheets tend to generally get tweaks and side grades on what they were before, whereas there should hopefully be a few more different attachments that can play the army in slightly different ways rather than the core one that the index gets at the moment. Otherwise, beyond that, with each update like this, there's at least a little bit of concern that some of the more generic Chaos Space Marine units might lose support. For example, World Eaters can't field cultists or generic Chaos Lords for some reason. I'd hope that Games Workshop don't do that for Death Guard, though it's not impossible, and at the very least it looks like cultists are losing their armament where they can take grenade launchers and special weapons and things, so I'd certainly expect that to go away. Otherwise, there should be a new combat patrol for the faction, which will broadly be a positive thing, almost whatever they do with it, I feel. And in general, I'd certainly not bother waiting until the Codex comes out before even beginning collecting. They're still a fully playable faction in-game at the moment, and will remain so after the Codex comes out. I'll start building up a balanced core to the army, though just with the knowledge that things will change in some ways in the future. For their game mechanics at the moment, the core rule for the Death Guard is Nurgle's Gift. You have a gradually expanding area of contagions around every model in your army, starting at 3 inches in the first battle round, then moving out to 6 and 9 in rounds 2 and 3. Within that aura, enemy units are -1 toughness, so a little bit easier to kill depending on the exact breakpoints with the weapon that you're attacking them with, and you also get one further debuff chosen at the start of the game. Often the better ones tend to be either better AP against those units within range, making them yet easier to kill for more armoured foes, or if you've got an army that doesn't really care about that too much, you can make them -1 to hit potentially. That can also be quite a nice debuff, particularly against melee units, which will always be within that range. Otherwise, for stratagems and things, there are a few useful ones. Sanguious Flux allows you either sustained hits 1 or sustained hits 2 in the fight phase. Sustained hits 2 if you've marked one of the objectives as an infected objective marker with the other bit of the faction core rule. And the Cloud of Flies one can be kind of handy as well, making a Death Guard get the stealth ability, and that can be kind of big in combination with the -1 ballistic skill that you can get from Spread the Sickness, as the two can stack as stealth modifies the hit roll, where the ballistic skill 1 actually modifies core ballistic skill. Finally, just for a rough example of what you could do with a 2000 point list for Death Guard, here's just one idea building around a combat patrol box set and then trying to flesh out the army in a fairly balanced way with a few Terminators, Demon Engines, and Mortarion himself. This army list is roughly 2000 points, but not exactly. I think it might just be a few points over if I've added that up right, but maybe more just to show a general idea, and this will certainly change as Games Workshop changes points with balance updates. In any case, leading the list we've got Mortarion, the Primarch himself, and a fun and durable centerpiece for the army. His Lieutenant-in-Chief Typhus is with him with his great big mortal wound attack. He's just an efficient model all around right now. And then we've got 2 units of 10 Plague Marines, each in a Rhino. Nice high objective control units to get to the midboard, fairly threatening, taking a mixture of melter guns, plasma guns, plague spewers, and heavy melee weapons in here, and riding into battle each in a Rhino, and accompanied by 1 character. One gets a Biologist Putrefier for the free grenade stratagem, and one a Foul Blight Spawn for the fights first and his Plague Sprayer. Beyond that, we've got 2 units of Death Shroud Terminators that will likely deep strike into battle. Typhus will be with one, and a Death Guard Sorcerer in Terminator armor will be with the other. Both really quite efficient and scary units. They could certainly think about rapid ingressing if it made sense. To hold some objectives and use the models from the Combat Patrol, we've got 2 units of 10 Poxwalkers, nice and cheap and can do secondary objectives and things, even if they're not really going to be doing much killing. And then for a bit of Demon Engine support, we've got 2 Plague Burst Crawlers with Entropy Cannons, Sluggers, and the Plague Burst Mortars to hit some enemies cowering out of line of sight, and 2 Feated Bloat Drones to push up the board nice and early and spread out those contagions to the enemy. They're both equipped with Flesh Mowers, but could have happily gone with the big Overwatch Plague Spitters. Finally, there's 1 unit of 3 allied Nurglings just to do a little bit of infiltrating or deep strike for objectives as the mission demands. Overall might not be 100% competitively optimized or anything like that, but maybe a reasonable enough idea as to what you could achieve with a 2000 point Death Guard army list right now. I feel like it does have multiple strong elements that you could definitely put your own twist on it. In any case, we'll leave that there for an overview of starting to collect Death Guard. Let me know your thoughts down in the comments below. Any tips from seasoned Death Guard generals are well appreciated, of course. If you'd like something else to watch, I'll leave my link for the strengths and weaknesses of every Death Guard unit down in the video description. Feel free to check that out if you want a bit more of an in-depth talk through the units in the faction. Feel free to subscribe to Auspex Tactics if you'd like to see more like this. I do tend to post new videos most days. And finally, if you have been enjoying all the videos on the channel, I would just like to mention that Auspex Tactics does have a Patreon page as well, and you can find that linked in the video description if you'd like to help support and keep these videos coming. Channel patrons do get a fair few advantages, seeing certain videos early, regular votes to see what sort of things happen next on the channel, and automatic entry into the regular prize giveaways with a chance to win some big model kits each month. If any of that sounds good to you, or you'd just like to help support, the link is down in the video description. In any case, a massive thank you for listening, and I'll hope to see you guys next time.